everybody. My name is Jon Moore. I'm a technical consultant here at Zengenti, and today I'm going to give you an introduction to content types, entries, and our delivery API. For those of you that don't know me, I've been with Zengenti now for 6 years, just over. The first 4 years or so was spent mainly working in the professional services teams, so working on everything from template implementation to base view development, and also migrations and integrations. And then more recently I've moved into the commercial side of the business, where I look at the technical aspects of new bids, and also support existing clients with any technical queries, as well as any technical training, bespoke training, and on-site consultation that you guys need. Today I'll start by showing you content types and entries from a UI perspective. So I think Richard showed you a couple of screenshots in his talk this morning. I'm going to go a bit more in depth and just expand on some of the functionality he mentioned in a bit more detail. And then we'll look at how you actually get that data onto a website using our delivery API, by taking you through some simple listing and record controls, and then I'm just going to touch at the end on a few advanced concepts. So if I come over here, so this is the CMS that we are going to be using today. Because I'm showing you code, I have zoomed in a little bit, so it wouldn't normally look quite so squashed. For those of you that haven't seen Contensis 9 before, or 9.1 even, I think the main difference really is that a lot of the options that were previously here at the top or here at the bottom, they're all now on the left-hand side here. So to access content types and entries, there's a couple of seats at the back because we're only doing it on the one screen, sorry.
You want to close up the gaps on this road so it's easy to get in.
Yeah.
Sorry guys.
I'm just waiting on people shuffle around. It's a higher than expected turnout, which is always good. So to access the content types and entry screen, it's the second option here on the left. That brings up this little new flyout panel component. And this is kind of a UI journey that we'll probably look at introducing more as we introduce new aspects of the CMS over time. So that takes me onto the content type screen, and you can see in this particular instance I'm using, we've got about 11,500 different items of content. I'm going to start first of all by showing you the person content type. For those of you who are on Contentis 8.3 or are more familiar with structured content and content definitions, you might be more used to working with a long XML file perhaps, which perhaps wasn't necessarily the easiest way of working. So we've basically done away with all that, and everything's now done through the UI, almost like an advanced form builder. And it's that easy and intuitive. You've actually even had, I think, content editors on some occasions going in, creating these and putting content in almost from day one of your projects. I'm actually going to zoom out for now, because can everybody see that okay still? Yeah, that should look better. Okay. So this is just a simple text field. You'll notice it's got this little title tag here. That relates to the entries listing screen, and also when you're retrieving the data through our delivery API. If I come on to validation, you can see we can set fields to be required. In the case of text fields, we can specify a minimum, maximum number of characters or a range. If I go to this official site field here, you can see we've got some pattern matching in place. So we want editors to enter content in a web address format. We've got some predefined common ones, such as postcode, email address. If you're reading Brave and you're familiar with the JavaScript regular expression syntax, you can actually do your own pattern matching or your own custom validation, and also display your own validation messages as well. We've also got date fields, where you can specify a single date or a range of dates, so start and end date, for example, on an event. Again, validation required fields. And then if I go onto the editor panel, you can again specify if editors can enter just a date or date and time, and also whether they can select future or past dates. They've also got a location field as well. So what that will do is that will use the Google API, and I'm actually using Leaflet.js to do the rendering on the front end, which is an open source map plugin. I suppose, is that the right term?
Yeah, Leaflet.js is just a JavaScript mapping framework that uses OpenStreetMaps underneath, and it's much more customizable in terms of just its UI.
So that's what we're using there, and then again you can specify whether people can actually search for that or not. That's using the Google API to get the data. We've also got image fields, so you can let editors enter or select a single or multiple images. And then we've also got, as Rich mentioned this morning, a content guidelines field now. So in the case of an image field, that could be directions for editors in terms of size or aspect ratio. If it was, say, a markup field where you're entering in a chunk of content using a simple WYSIWYG editor, there might be some information on tone or voice, but you've taken from any internal content style guides that you might have in place. And then we've got a whole host of other fields as well. So we've got taxonomy for tagging and categorizing content, assets for linking to things like Word and PDF documents. And then we've got an entry field, which is for doing linked or shared content, really. So in the case of this environment, we've got a movie content type where you can select members of the cast or directors, and those are all populated using the person content type. Just to show you the entry screen, don't see the changes here. So if I filter this down to person, you can see we've taken the performance of it into consideration quite heavily. So even though there's 11,500 items, the UI is actually quite quick in terms of searching for the information. I'll just click to edit one of these, so you can see it's very much form-based, nice, clean and simple for editors. Required fields are clearly marked. For date fields, we give you a nice little date picker. For the location field, this one's got the search enabled. So I could search for Zengenti, and that will then change the point on my map then. If I scroll down a bit further, you can see this is the photo. You can also set a caption, so that could also be the alt text to the image as well for accessibility. If I come on to browse, this brings up the new asset gallery. So this is very much kind of light touch version 1. Longer term, this is what we're going to be building on as we add new features from the digital asset management point of view. And all this is using, again, Elasticsearch. And you can search here by name or by folder path as well. And then even there's nice little touches. So for building fields, it's just a nice little switch or toggle for editors, just to make the whole editing experience as simple and as intuitive as possible. So what I'm going to walk you through now is actually how you render this content on the front end using our delivery API. So I'm just going to now actually zoom in a bit more, so you'll actually be able to see the code. So at the moment this is all done through the razor views. I'm just going to collapse that panel there. Can everyone read that okay, clearly enough? Okay. So I'm not going to go too in depth, just in case we've got any people who aren't 100% perhaps au fait with C#. But essentially these first few lines here at the top, they're basically pulling in the Contensis APIs and libraries. This line here at the top, this contensis.client.create, that's basically creating a connection using OAuth 2 to our APIs to allow me to retrieve that information. So what I'm going to do first is define query. So do you want to, sorry, come down here, Andrew. I think there's a seat. There's one at the front, or there's one at that corner there. Now you notice I'm getting a certain amount of IntelliSense here. We haven't got true IntelliSense yet for the .NET API. What it is doing though is picking up words and phrases that actually already exist in this file, which is still quite useful. As you'll see in a second, so if I say var movie query equals new query, if you're familiar with our web API, the syntax I'm going to show you now is a little bit different. But if you've ever looked at any of our popular documentation, you can see the syntax is actually very similar to that. And that's something that we're going to try and do a lot more of going forward, is any API that we develop, we're going to keep the syntax of those APIs as consistent as we possibly can to create that kind of smooth developer experience and make it easy for you to pick up and use them. So I can say op dot. So it's picking up equal to because it already exists in this file. Op dot equal to. I'm now doing some live coding, so obviously nothing will go wrong and everything will work smoothly. So here I'm doing sys.contentType movie. The sys prefix, that's for data or properties that you'll always be able to get about a content type or entry, regardless of whatever custom fields you've defined. So things like content type ID, the version number, the date it was published on, all of that information will always be available to you. Dot equal to. I'm also not used to using the Mac, so if I make any spelling errors, please feel free to put them out, just as I did there. So because this is a Boolean field, I can just define that as being true. Now you'll notice, but unlike this query down here, I haven't done the op.and, and that's because the default logical operator of our delivery API is and, but you have got all the kind of standard operators that you would expect through our API, so and, or, not, between, starts with, ends with, etc. They're all documented with some basic examples. You can also do, I suppose, what we call subqueries, so I can say op.or, and I can define another set of parameters in there. You can do chaining of queries as well, so it's really kind of flexible. You can handle anything from simple queries here to some quite complex queries. So what we can also do is do some ordering. So I can say, so now it's picking up my movie query variable, so I can say dot order by dot add, and I can go minus release date. So the minus means descending. If I didn't have the minus, it would just be ascending. And then I can define a page size. So in this case, I'm going to say get me the first 6. There is also a page.index property as well. So if you want to do listing controls with paging, then that's something you can do quite easily through our delivery API as well. So now we've defined our query, we actually need to get some data back. So I'm going to say page list, and then because we're using the typed models, which you mentioned earlier, I'm strongly typing it in this case because we're going to get back movies. This is something which is actually optional, so you don't necessarily have to do it. You could just do, I could just do var in that case, for example, and it would still get me the data. This is just showing you kind of the most recommended best practice way of doing it, and I will show you how easy it is to actually do these type models yourself, or yourselves at the end, hopefully. Enough and stop talking. So I can say client dot entries dot search. So search will allow me to get back a collection of entries. and then I can say movie query, so pass my query in, and then there I'm defining a link depth of 1, which will allow me to get back any linked images. If I scroll a bit further down, you can see I've already got some markup in place, which is probably actually representative of what you do in a real world scenario, in terms of you probably have this HTML cut up and ready to just then copy and paste it into Contensis and just add the API bits around that to do the rendering dynamically. So I can say app for each of our film in featured movies dot items. So dot items will give me back the collection of entries, and then I'm just going to format this code a bit. This is now me being a bit pedantic from a coding point of view in terms of wanting things to be indented. So that's not moving fast as I'd like. So all I can now do is just update this to say at film.movie URL. For the post image, I can just say at film.poster image, and then because an image is actually treated as an asset, I can say asset.uri, that gives me access to a slightly different set of properties. Give an asset, so for the title, and I can simply do at film.title. And what that will actually give me back is the data for the field that we define as the title field in the content type. That field could also be called title if you wanted it to. And then I can go at film.title there as well. And then hopefully, moment of truth, pop-ups. I can hear some laughs around the room.
Laughs are familiar.
So that's previewing, so hopefully the connection will allow fast enough. The Wi-Fi's here. And now the Wi-Fi, there we go. Yes. So you can see here we have a list of featured films. What I'd want to do now is perhaps click on one of those to go into a record page. So if I jump back to the CMS and then go to folders and then movie. Now, one thing I'm going to point out at this point is that we're no longer here dealing with physical pages. In terms of every entry is actually just a collection of data that exists in Contensis, and yes, that can be put onto a website. It has Scott and Dan are going to show you this afternoon. It can also just as easily be pulled into a third-party system or a mobile application. So what we have got is a single page that's got a razor view on it, and then the content as such is rendered on the fly dynamically. And you can do that either by passing an ID onto the query string, which is what we're doing here for the sake of simplicity, or what we actually typically do in a real world scenario is implement that using clean SEO friendly URLs, so you can still have /courses /undergraduate /course.aspx, course2.aspx, etc. And we're going to very shortly look at documenting how you can actually do that yourself. We've done it a couple of times now, so we've got a good set of code that we can actually use and document for you. So again, you can see here we're just again creating a connection to the API, and we're just picking up an ID off the query string. So I can say var movie equals client dot entries dot get in this case, because I'm only getting back a single entry. And then again, I'm still strongly typing it to be movie. Again, this is optional. So what I'm going to do is pass in the ID. Well, I've put null. If you wanted to, you could pass in the language. So as I think which Tim showed you this morning, multilingual is kind of a first-class citizen almost. And then I'm going to specify a link depth of 2 in this case, and that's because we've got a movie that's got linked people who then got their own images associated with them. So you can, and what that does is that resolves all those assets for you, so in effect you can just get the URLs of those directly through the delivery API. All of that stuff's all documented as well in terms of how that works. For the page title, what I'm actually going to do is say current context.page.title. And the reason I'm doing it this way is because not only will that set the title of the page in terms of the H1, it will also set the metadata title for this content, so that's what search engines will use and how they crawlers to index your site. So for that I can just say movie.title. And then again, so once we've got our movie defined, we can just say movie.title. Again, I've just got some HTML, I've just copied and pasted in with some placeholders or reminders for myself. So interestingly, that's actually picked up some code that I've already added previously into this file as well, so the IntelliSense is actually quite intuitive with the Monaco editor. Again, poster image. Poster image. URI. I'm not gonna, you'll be glad to hear I'm actually gonna type out the whole thing as such. So what, as I mentioned, what you can also do is pull in linked entries. So in this case here, you can see we're checking if we've got any directors associated with an entry. And then all I simply need to do here is say app for each director movie dot directive. Yep, that's right. So now because I'm using actual raw HTML elements, you can see we get much richer IntelliSense. So then I can say app director.name, and again IntelliSense will automatically give me the closing li as the first option, so I can just press tab. If you come a bit further down, you can see here that for the actors I'm saying take 14, so that'll only get me the first 14 actors. And you can also see here we're pulling through the photo URL, and that will resolve because we've defined the link depth correctly above. So I'm just going to save that now, preview that. That would just force the changes out. Well, I haven't, because I've not actually put anything on the query string, that would actually give me an error. So what I'm going to do now is actually just select one of these, and hopefully, while I've been talking, those changes will have published out and published through, or it will give me an error that I've made. Which it has, and in typical fashion I've missed a closing semicolon, but what this does give me the chance to show you is the fact we've now got go to line in the new editor, and as per usual it's a missing closing semicolon. So actually let me just preview that out. This one on 57.
I think you need a bar, don't you? Before
Yes, I do. Thank you very much. Right, that's the error I actually wanted to see. So because there's nothing on the query string, it's saying ID is blank. So hopefully now, if I go back to home and click on the record, ta-da! So you can see here, if you can look at the see on tab here at the top, it's actually set the metadata title of the page. That's what Google tabs pick up. Got the title, got the tagline, the overview, you've got the list of directors, you've got the poster image being pulled through, the featured cast, the release date, some other information as well. How this information is displayed will be completely up to you. The data is just all there, ready for you to do with as you please. What I'll do is, because we've got 10 minutes, I'll actually, before I start looking at some more advanced stuff, does anyone have any questions now? Before I move on? No? Okay. As I said, as we've mentioned at the start, in Contensis 9.1 we've introduced type models, which if you're working in Visual Studio, will give you better IntelliSense, better error handling as well. It also allows you to separate some of the logic out from the main Razor view and put it in a central place. So what we've got here is this models file in app code. And you can see here we've got person. I'll just show you the movie one. This class name here, that I believe needs to match the name of the content type to allow us to do the mapping on the fly for you. This effect just says this is an entry model. And then these variables here, as long as they match the field names or IDs within the content type, we do all the mapping of the data for you automatically. The casing is irrelevant because the IDs are stored behind the scenes as lowercase. We're using camel case here in this case. But you can see if we've got this release date formatted, so that's checking if there's a release date and then formatting it in here so we can separate that logic from the Razor view. Again, for things like budgets, formatting those into a currency, taxonomy data, getting cached images, setting URLs. So all of that logic, you can now actually take that out of your Razor view. So the only code that's actually in your Razor view is in effect related to presentation really. So as you saw, I was just doing at film dot whatever I needed. So hopefully what you've seen is that actually, as well as being easy to get this data in and create these content types, it's also quite easy to do from a rendering point of view in terms of actually getting the data out. All of that stuff around typed models, that's also all documented as well with examples. Examples in the documentation are actually using based on a movie, so there might even be some familiar code that you've just seen in my demonstration, might also be in our documentation as well. And that's all there for you. So yeah, we've got full documentation of the API with some snippets as well. So hopefully you'll find it really easy once you're on Contensis 9, if you're not already, to get creating these and start rendering them. If you have got any questions, by all means, I'm happy to answer them. I'm sure Richard will be as well. Sai or anyone from the product team really. Any questions again at this point?
Can you import stuff into a content type?
Yes, you can. From anything really. Do you want to fill in here?
We currently have a management API which isn't available sort of publicly yet. That's coming out in 9.3. The reason it's coming out in 9.3, not 9.2, is we've been working on a new validation framework to ensure that the data that goes in is really checked for data integrity, so we're keeping clean data in there. So yeah, we've delayed it by a couple of weeks to get that validation framework in. So yeah, that's coming out in 9.3. So the actual documentation for the API is available, and I'll put it on our Slack channel. But if people want to kind of go and have a look on how we're doing that, we've been writing the documentation before the APIs have been developed. So we've got some clear endpoints defined as we're going through the building development process. So yeah, you'll be able to keep an eye on what's going on with that through that documentation. So yeah, it's coming, but we're already doing imports in the background. So like the movie database that we've got on there with the 11,000 entries, that's just a cut down version of actually movie data that we've got available elsewhere. We've done an import of over 100,000 movies from an open source movie database. So we've created imports between systems already. The NNNI project Richard referred to right at the beginning, that was an import as well. So yeah, it's completely possible to import from whatever system you want.
And could that then, could a content type in Contensis be synchronized for a feed from an external database?
It depends how you develop your import. If you create an import tool that wants to carry on pushing entries in, there's no reason not to.
Yeah, content can easily just flow in and out of Contensis, really. It just depends exactly on what you want to do. It's not really our content to hold as such, it's kind of your content to do with whatever you want to within your organisation.
The real advantage of that is like you might have data that exists in an external system that you want to model further. You want to add in some additional fields that you can't do in that external system. So you could keep on importing that data into those same content types, model further, add in more levels of detail, and use our REST service to pull that data out as a whole. So essentially Contensis becomes this gold standard of your content, and being able to get it in and out into whatever instance that you want, whether it's a mobile app, a website, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, if we want to migrate content from structured templates to content types, how do we go about that? Is there a process of translating those, or is it build it and then use the management API to pull data?
Essentially, we're not providing a direct tool to migrate from structured content through to content types, and the management API will provide that kind of support to do that. The reason is, what we tend to find is that people are kind of, as they're redeveloping an area of their site, they'll define that new model and they'll shape that. You can do that import, so you don't that sort of default tool to do that is the management API essentially, because you might be shaping it, bringing data in from additional systems as well.
Sorry, I was going to say, is this stuff going to get folded into the kind of structured content? Because we've got, for example, loads of events and news and stuff like that, which I think people will still want a page, and we'll have to persist the existing URL anyway.
Yeah.
Is there any way that could put the? So it's kind of fine for doing content types as a secondary thing for going forward. But I'm thinking, will any of this kind of validation stuff get folded into the structured content?
No, it's not going to get pushed back into existing content definitions. It would be migrate out of one and set up your routing to mimic your existing structure as you have today. It won't be folded back into previous version, into previous structures.
So basically, this kind of is the end of structured content.
Yeah. Yeah, 8.3, we put in the kind of content definition screen within the management console, so you could kind of manage those content types, and that's the last set of changes we're making to content definitions. Moving forward, any further changes then will be, and improvements are going to be added to content types and entries.
So where does this, in terms of, I'm thinking, that doesn't affect us, we've been around for 7 years, but in terms of new customers, are you basically saying don't use news and events unless?
What we found over the years is as we brought people on board, what we're tending to find is that the news and events modules and the structure around that data, we're having to massage and extend with metadata and such to support all the different fields that people want to add. So actually a lot of the existing modules and the way that those are structured don't always fit the needs of organisations now. So for example, lots of new sites don't use the web controls. there's custom razor views or custom raise template listings against the controls, because not only is the data not necessarily shaped in the way that they want, but isn't necessarily being rendered in the way they want as well. So what we've seen in professional services is kind of a move to doing everything as custom razor, to get the kind of sites that people want to kind of deploy and see on their websites.
And we have got lots of examples of that stuff, but we're quite happy to share with you guys as well. Like if there's something that you want to do and you're not sure how to do it, please let us know. Because either more than likely someone will have done it, know how to do it, or have an example of it. So don't just sit there suffering in silence, going, "Oh, I can't do this."
So would you have, for example, code that could just be dropped in, or could be run as a job, which would pick up the last 7 years' worth of news items and be able to convert them to some sort of replacement thing that we could then extend?
We haven't
Or
done any.
would we have to? Is each client going to have to write that from scratch if they want to be?
I don't know, that's the easy bit actually, because the difficulty you're going to have is replacing every single page with someone's put a listing control in the past 7 years.
Very true, although that again is the sort of thing that, that question as well. So, it's for the existing client with a number of years of data behind them. Are you looking at a toolkit to migrate that sort of, the two standard types, the news events type, into this variety?
The answer to that would be no. We haven't seen a real need for that at the moment, because what we're tending to find is as site redevelopment goes on, new template designs, new site redesigns, and rethinking of their existing site, we haven't seen the need to do that. If we have a number of clients who come forward who kind of go, this is a migration path we want, we might provide, so for example, a tool or a set of code that would show you how to use the management API to move that content over, and how you might use a generic listing to display that content and almost provide that. But we haven't seen a direct need for that at present.
And what we probably provide that as a razor view format, perhaps even for the marketplace as well. With Aviva, you could then, with some very basic like ULI type markup, with the intention that you could just tweak the markup as you needed to for your own templates. And then, I'm sure if you ever do develop anything to migrate from old to new, we'd probably share that with you as well in some shape or form.
How about the URLs?
So that, I think, I was speaking to Sai about 2 days ago, and that is something that is definitely on his radar to document. Rich might be able to give you an idea of when to put you on the spot, Sai, Rich.
We're going to touch on some items later on that Rich has obviously referred to with regards to new publishing platform. And so we've got one item in our backlog which is all about routing URLs, routing content through content types and entries, and the guys have done quite a lot of custom work on a couple of sites that we've got a good solid code base that we can be providing to anyone who's moving over to this type of way of working. So routing's already kind of been worked out and has been tested and is kind of bulletproof that we can provide. The aspects of routing are on the roadmap. It's just that we're prioritising various features at the moment to fit in line with various projects and overall kind of expectations of the product. So routing is something we've got, and we intend on fully documenting alongside the delivery API, so you've got everything that you need to be able to fulfill these requirements.
And on that note, it's actually, by my watch, I make it lunch. I make it 15:15, so not wanting to eat into your precious lunchtime. If you do have any questions, then like I said, just feel free to
I'm around throughout lunch, so
grab one of us. Thank you all for your time. Thank you for filling out the room as well.
Thanks, John.
Thank you guys.